Have you ever been in a situation where you loved someone with all your heart, but instead of returning to your love, you chose to waste it on another person over and over again? Well, that's exactly the story of God and the Israelites in the Old Testament. If there's one thing we can tell for sure from the Old Testament scriptures, it's the fact that God really loved Israel and he showed them so much favor. Sadly, though, the Israelites were not always returning that love as constantly as God gave it. Instead, they would often stray off and worship other gods, especially Baal and Asherah. But then, come to think of it, why would the Israelites continually struggle with the worship of Baal despite enjoying so much love from God and knowing his jealousy and hate for idolatry? And who exactly was this Baal? Well, I'm about to answer all your questions in this video. Walk with me as I explain the origins of Baal and why its worship was a constant struggle for the Israelites. Who is Baal? If an idol could compete with God for the heart and devotion of the Israelites, then this idol must be powerful, don't you think? But who is he? And why is he so special that the Israelites kept going back to it despite Yahweh's constant warnings and punishments? Before we establish what the scriptures say about Baal, let's paint a clear picture of this Canaanite deity. Baal is a Canaanite Phoenician god of fertility and weather, specifically rainstorms. The name was also used as a title, which it meant Lord, and it was applied to a number of different deities throughout the ancient Near East. However, the main deity often referred to in the Bible is the deity, historically designated as the universal god of fertility, and in that capacity, he was often referred to as the prince or lord of the earth. In the past, many people believed him to be the lord of rain and dew, the two forms of moisture that help to soften the ground and make the soil fertile. So it was necessary for the people who believed in it to seek its favor for agricultural increase and human fertility. This led to the adoption of extreme forms of occultism, including the practice of ritual prostitution and child sacrifice. According to information available through archaeological excavation, the worship of Baal dates back as far as the 2nd millennium BC. However, Baal worship did not become popular until the 1400s when it caught fire in Egypt. But it's obvious that it existed long before this time when God established the law. Many Bible scholars and history researchers even believe that the worship of Baal to be the reason God banned the consumption of pork, since pig slaughter and sacrifice were a big hallmark of Baal worship. So what does the Bible say about Baal? The first time we read of the worship of Baal in the Bible is in the book of Numbers, where Moses recounts his experiences with the Israelites on their way from Egypt to the Promised Land. Numbers 25 verses 1 to 3. While Israel remained at Shittim, the people began to commit infidelity with the daughters of Moab, for they invited the people to their sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel became followers of Baal and Peor, and the Lord was angry with Israel. As the chapter progresses, it goes on to talk about the several times the Israelites rebelled against the God who freed them and performed many magnificent signs for them. At some point during this journey, the Israelites began to have inappropriate sexual relationships with the women of Moab. By letting these women into their lives, they also let everything that concerned them into their lives, including the worship of the Moabite gods. This unfortunate trend would follow the Israelites throughout the Old Testament, often igniting God's anger against them. However, this worship would peak around 840 BC when Israel was classified as two kingdoms. At some point during this time, Ahab became the king of one of the kingdoms. The Bible identifies him as one of the most wicked men to ever rule Israel. But guess who else was even more wicked? You guessed rightly, his wife Jezebel. Historically, we've always seen idol worship take a stronghold whenever an Israelite king married a foreign woman. However, beyond bringing the worship of Baal to Israel, Jezebel was also popular for persecuting God's prophets. Even the prophet Elijah had to go into hiding for some time to escape Jezebel's persecution. God would later use Elijah to defeat Baal and Jezebel, but first he proved to the Israelites and all the worshippers of Baal that he, not Baal, controlled the weather by causing drought in the land for 3.5 years. 1 Kings 17 verse 1. Now Elijah, who was from Tishbe in Gilead, told King Ahab, As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word. Remember the meaning of Baal? It means Lord. Baal and most other idols want to gain lordship and control over the heart of man, and they'll do anything to achieve this. So again, to set the context in biblical terms, we must also talk about the period when the Israelites entered the Promised Land under Joshua's guidance. On entering Canaan, they found that the Canaanites worshipped a multitude of gods who were not unlike the gods of Egypt, although they had different names and some different characteristics. The Bible, however, singles out Baal as the principal god of the Canaanites, and archaeological discoveries confirm his preeminence. According to Judges chapter 2, verse 11, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Also, one of the meanings of Baal is husband, and as Christians, we know that God has constantly called us his brides. It means that Baal is competing with God as our husband and the head of our hearts. Thus, he's doing everything and anything to get us to spiritually divorce ourselves from God and enter into a covenant with him. He wants to pull us away from God and make us bow down to him. So why was the worship of Baal so attractive? If the Bible speaks so badly about Baal and his worship, then why do the Israelites continue to fall into this act? They knew God and had God's law. They also saw God turn his back against them whenever they turned to the worship of Baal. Why then was it so hard to avoid this God that constantly got them into trouble with the true God of Israel? Number 1. Sexual pleasure. One of the leading causes of Israel's constant attachment to Baal was the sexual pleasure they derived from it. Since the worship of Baal encouraged temple prostitution, it obviously became a new religion that fostered sexual freedom among the Israelites. A suitable scripture context for this is in Numbers 25, verses 1 to 3. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. From this scripture, you can see that one of the reasons the Israelites were so addicted to worshiping Baal was its appeal to the flesh. While their major excuse was their desire for bountiful crops and herds, the underlying reason was the glorification of sex and sexual activities. This is evidenced in the many figurines that have been unearthed by archaeologists over the years. These figurines, often marked with exaggerated sexual features, depict the sexual arousal that swept through the lands during this time. Feasting, music, and dancing set the tone for several licentious behaviors. Let's paint a picture for a bit. Imagine a typical party scene in early autumn. The setting is strikingly natural, gorged by feasting and stimulated by wine, as the worshippers dance the special fertility dance dedicated to awakening Baal from his summer inactivity. The land needs the blessing of rainfall, so the worshippers dance alluringly around the pillars and sacred poles. The movements, particularly those of the temple prostitutes, are sensual and erotic. The audience, all drunk in ecstasy, cheer them on, and legends have it that, as the dance climaxes, the dancers retire to the chambers of the house of Baal for immoral relations. We can closely link this to what happened when the Israelites molded a golden calf in the wilderness and worshipped it. Number 2. The false sense of protection it offered. While the sensual pleasure that this worship brings was a major attraction for many, fear also drove many Israelites towards Baal worship. God has also kept to his promise of protecting and providing for the Israelites. However, oftentimes, when the Israelites see challenges coming, they easily lose their faith in God. And as they lose their faith in God, they suddenly become scared of death, scared of the unknown. This fear often drives them to spirituality, which in turn involves rites of the utmost depravity. These were the generations of Israelites who chose to work by sight and not by faith. If God had promised to always keep and protect them, would he not keep to his promise? Why, then, did they still think that they needed to work for their safety? But do we not also follow this path when we're troubled by the problems of this world? Walking by faith and not by sight means having an eternal perspective of every situation we face. It means fixing our eyes on what is eternal. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18, we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. When the challenges of life strike, God expects us to continue to focus on Him, not our strength, ability, or connections. While these things are good, they should not be the basis of our hope. Christ, who is the author and finisher of our faith, should be the rock upon which our faith is built. Number 3, because they saw other nations do it. National peer pressure was also a major cause of Israel's constant switch to the worship of Baal. The nations around them worshipped idols, so it felt archaic for them to operate a different kind of worship. It seemed like Israel loved to imbibe foreign culture. This is evident in their demand for a king during the time of the prophet Samuel. They had seen other nations ruled over by kings, so they passionately desired to have kings too. We can see from that story that the Israelites didn't have any genuine reason to demand a king. However, because they wanted to be like other nations, not minding what God wanted them to be, they demanded this system of government. Apparently, they had the same problem when it came to worship. They admired the mode of worship of the surrounding nations and desired to worship like them. In our modern-day world, we can still see elements of the worship of Baal. There is a return of Baal worship that we are witnessing, and it seems like we can't do anything about it, just like the Israelites didn't do anything about it. Remember we talked about sexual pleasures as one of the leading causes of Israel's attachment to Baal? By looking at our culture today, we can see that we still live in a world that worships and adores fleshly pleasures. As long as it feels good, then it's good to go. This was a major aspect of Baal worship in the Old Testament. It was a religion that appealed to the flesh. All the flesh wants is pleasure, and it can go to the farthest extent to get the gratification of pleasure. Unfortunately, while the flesh enjoys pleasure so much, it never reminds us of the consequences of pleasure seeking. According to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 3, all of us who also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. And like the rest, we were, by nature, deserving of wrath. If you look at the world today, it's becoming more evident that people live to gratifying the cravings of their flesh. And this is the core value upon which Baal's worship is built, the lust of the flesh. The allure of illicit sex, drunkenness, and unnatural sexual perversion. Baal worship was rooted in sensuality and involved ritualistic prostitution even in its temple. As people turn to pleasure-seeking over God-seeking, they're throwing God's love right back to Himself. We live in an era of eat and live all that you can now, for you do not know tomorrow. But is this religion of pleasure not selfish, especially since it pushes us to our sinful desire for mundane things above the well-being and future of others? No wonder the statistics of divorce and marriages crashing within and outside the church have continued to increase. It is obvious that more and more people are choosing to give themselves to mindless merriment. Fornication and adultery have become even more accessible in our time. For instance, you can now simply log on to some apps or websites to see sex seekers within your immediate neighborhood. Promiscuity is on the increase, but remember that the devil is the father of deceit. He often deceives even religious people to believe that they can live a double life. But the truth is that you can't. You really can't. That secret pleasure you have and have been hiding from your husband, wife, family, and church members will destroy you if you don't stop. Like Baal and the Israelites, it'll turn you against God, causing His anger to fall upon you. For while God is a merciful and gracious God, He is also jealous and won't want you to share your love and dedication to Him with another thing, not even your fleshly desires. Sin is deceptive. Sin is destructive. Numbers chapter 32, verse 23. But if you fail to keep your word, then you will have sinned against the Lord, and you may be sure that your sin will find you out. Before giving in to pleasure, think about how it can destroy your life and the lives of your loved ones. Some people may argue that there's nothing wrong with pursuing certain kinds of pleasure, but that's a lie, because often when we turn our hearts to the pleasure that our flesh desires, we turn away from Christ, who is the source of our salvation and redemption. In fact, He should be the center of our lives. So you see, while it's easy to cast stones on the Israelites from our exalted seats of self-righteousness, we must also constantly check ourselves to be sure that we are not going down the same destructive path. You may ask, why are others who have given themselves to the worship of Baal succeeding? Well, we will leave the answer to that question for God. But one thing is certain. They're traveling on the proverbial wide road, which leads to destruction. Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. Enter ye at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be who go in through it. That's it for today, brethren. Did you learn anything new about Baal? Let me know what you think about the worship of Baal, especially in today's world, in the comments section below. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. I promise to bring you more exciting and truth-revealing videos of biblical stories. Thank you for watching, and may God richly bless you.